Friends, we have an exclusive for you. Welcome, everyone. Valery Dmitrievich Solovey, political scientist. Valery Dmitrievich, hello.
Hello again. Greetings to all our esteemed viewers and listeners.
Please give this video a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Yes, that's right. Happy to have you. If you usually watch on the Primoy channel website, click on the title. There you'll find options to listen and subscribe. And of course, make sure to follow all the social networks and the YouTube channel of Valery Dmitrievich as well. This is very important. Friends, let's get started in Dmitry. So while preparing for this interview with you, I looked up the following information. An agency reports that several journalists from the Kremlin pool have admitted they are ready to believe in Putin having a double. So they reported that people who work with Putin, his close circle, believe that doubles exist because they can't make sense of these oddities. Putin's behavior, where sometimes he follows the sanitary restrictions related to the epidemic and other times he doesn't. How do you assess the fact that now even the pool of journalists around Putin admits that he has doubles?
Well, I just understand. It's actually quite simple. The idea is not yet taking hold among the masses, but among those who can be considered opinion leaders. And in fact, there is no other explanation for the blatant contradictions in the behavior and appearance of the so-called Russian president. I want to emphasize right away that the mere fact of the existence of doubles does not necessarily mean, as I say, and I'm ready to confirm time and again, that Putin has died. But at the very least, it leads us to consider this possibility. And the double who is currently appearing in particular is strikingly different from Putin. In fact, the difference is striking. Recently, a phonoscopic examination was conducted in Britain. The results of this examination were published in the Daily Mail. No, I think it was the Daily Express. Of course, that's a tabloid. But the point isn't which publication it appeared in, but the examination itself. So, according to the author of this examination, a fairly well-known specialist, the Putin who spoke on May 9th, 2023, and the Putin who spoke at the World Russian People's Council have phonoscopic characteristics that differ by 99%. You know that even in DNA analysis, there's never 100%. They say 99.99 or 99, something like that. So, in fact, this is a claim that these are different people. By the way, the explanation is available in Russian. This information is on the Posuti Telegram channel. This is a Telegram channel run by my former students, and I would say this channel stands out for providing high-quality information. So, thank you. For those who are interested, I refer you to this Telegram channel. You can go there and take a look. There you'll find a detailed summary of this article. Moreover, this is not the first phonoscopic examination that has been conducted. It has been carried out several more times. In particular, it was conducted with the Japanese. That was sometime in the spring. And the Japanese, even before the results were published, shared the data with me. And they told me that 5 experts who studied the anthropological and phonoscopic characteristics, in other words, how the person speaks, these 5 experts unequivocally stated that there are 3 different Putins. And I have always said that Putin has 2 doubles. The main double is the one who is currently the president of the Russian Federation.
He's Vasilich?
He's Vasilich. His real patronymic is Vasilich. But since he changed his last name, first name, and patronymic, he is now Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Of course, this is cheap casuistry, I understand. Well, Russia is the country it is, for better or worse. So this idea will also start to break through into people's consciousness. Moreover, it already has. Here are the FSO poll results that were just recently, this morning in fact, published by the General SVR Telegram channel. 70% of people in Russia have heard about Putin's death, and 18% believe it. And 41% consider that it might be true. This means that half are inclined to agree that Putin is no longer alive. And you have to agree, this is a completely different informational and psychological reality compared to what it was, say, before the end of October. And it was created through the efforts of the General SVR Telegram channel, myself, and through journalists who, in one way or another, fueled and discussed this news.
Friends, we are all instruments in the hands of Valery Dmitrievich. That's how it turns out.
And of course, I'd like to flatter myself, but that wouldn't be true. But as far as PR goes, it's brilliant. From a PR perspective, this is a brilliant campaign. Brilliant. I think it will be studied. It will definitely make it into the textbooks, especially when it's confirmed, when there will be such evidence that it's an absolute 100%, 146% truth.
Valery Dmitrievich, look, first of all, memes like this are starting to appear. Your refrigerator is full. I showed them to you before the program. I especially like the Smeg meme. It did the branding for Solovey. So buy a refrigerator. It's amazing.
Wonderful.
Notice that the tallest refrigerator is named after you, Valery Dmitrievich. So the yellow appliance, the tallest Solovey brand, if you like, you can buy it. Valery Dmitrievich, since you are a successful businessman, I'm afraid that Potanin, the richest man in Russia, who, by the way, was recently in Azov Arabia, might have to make room because Valery Dmitrievich, you could really build a great business career for yourself. But let's get back to your...
I'm not in business, Dasha. Thank you, but that's not my path.
Valery Dmitrievich, you see other brands are already parasitizing on you. So be vigilant, collect your royalties. Yes.
I'll try.
Now, on to something serious. Yes, Putin has started disappearing more often. For example, according to the VJ agency in January, probably at the beginning of this year, he appeared in public only 7 days. So from November 1st, 2022 to October 31st, 2023, Vladimir Putin appeared in public only 147 days, which is almost 40% less than the number of working days for other citizens, according to the project's calculations. So what they're all saying is, what does this indicate? That Putin appears in public very rarely, especially in recent months. Is this really connected to your theories, to your statements about Putin being in a freezer?
The project interprets it as Putin being tired of the people. I'd probably like to add to that phrase. And the people are even more tired of him, including the people of the Russian Federation. Again, according to the FSO poll that was mentioned, only 26% of Russian citizens trust the Russian president. Not 70% at all. That's the first point. Second, of the factors cited by the project. Naturally, I don't question the facts. From this good work, a completely different conclusion and a completely different interpretation could follow. The one I have always given throughout this past year, that Putin is seriously ill, very seriously ill, that he appears in public less and less often, that he is increasingly being replaced by a double. The last time we saw the real Putin in public was on September 4th when he met with Erdogan. Already when Lukashenko flew to Moscow, he was met by a double, although the negotiations Lukashenko held were with Putin, a gravely ill Putin, who was in a nearly bedridden state, and it was also a double who flew to meet with Xi Jinping. Therefore, everything presented by the project has a very simple explanation, which I have given in advance and repeatedly. You just need to open your eyes a little, just a bit, and admit that there are other explanations, which are much better than the one proposed by the project. Much more realistic, because this is Russian phantasmagoria.
Valery Dmitrievich, there's a rather important point here. You said that Patrushev, the man preparing the power transition, Nikolai Patrushev, is also ill and has cancer. Am I mistaken?
You are not mistaken, he has cancer. Prostate cancer, but he's in good shape. He has had a stable long-term remission. Prostate cancer is treated very well nowadays. This in general is not one of Putin's secrets. It was simply a fatal form of cancer that even the most advanced treatments could not cure, could not achieve remission, only slow it down, and they treated him. Israeli doctors were overseeing the treatment from February 2020, but in the spring of this year, they stopped supervising the treatment. They said, well, medicine is powerless. Everything else is in God's hands. Although it was unlikely to be exactly as they said. But this was already connected with politics. Valery Dmitrievich.
You said that Putin's children, his sons from Alina, were also treated in Israel.
Kabana, son, yes.
Go on.
Absolutely right. And they cured him, it was in my opinion in 1919, if not earlier. They cured his son, he had cancer, they successfully cured his son. The treatment was supervised directly by Netanyahu, who was then also prime minister, as he is now, and Putin. After that, he developed great respect and trust for Israeli medicine and a personal fondness for Netanyahu. However, he understands that there was nowhere else in the world he could get treatment, because he couldn't be treated in Germany or the United States. That left Israel and China, but China doesn't have such advanced medicine. In this area, the Chinese were treated for Parkinson's. He has Parkinson's since around 2014, but it's not a fatal disease. The Chinese managed to quite successfully alleviate the symptoms of Parkinson's with the medications they offered him. But as for the treatment of the main illness, cancer, a severe form of cancer with metastases, he already had multiple metastases which appeared this year after New Year's. The Israelis were handling this quite successfully, although they said that they still wouldn't be able to cure him. They warned him about this right away, honestly. And the medical board in September of this year said that he wouldn't survive. They told him this to his face. After that, he lost all sense of taste. Not just for politics, but for life in general. He even stopped communicating with Alina and the children. He used to enjoy it from time to time, after all. He likes spending time with his little children. So
that is, he has 3 children with Alina Kabaeva and 2 daughters from his first wife. But you said that one of them,
let me clarify. No, his eldest daughter is not his biological daughter. I won't tell this story, although I think viewers who aren't lacking in intelligence can easily guess what it's about. So that's the first thing. Second, he has a daughter from Krivonogik. And he also has a boy, I think, a boy from a very famous Russian athlete. These are the ones I personally know of. Maybe there are others, but I think that's the complete list.
well, yes, there were many different women and many young children involved, and he specifically names some of his own children here. He also, of course, made sure to mention these various women in his accounts as well. I was really interested to learn about the astrologer. In one of your stream interviews, you talked about the astrologer. Let's watch a clip.
Astrologer Svetlana Dragan believes that very significant changes will begin on October 26th this week, on Thursday. She is often said to be close to the FSB and that she is used to influence the beliefs of Russians. Millions watch her, and she even has a program on Channel 1. Are the rumors about Putin's health problems connected to these statements? Dragan.
They very well could be connected, though not to the FSB, but rather close to the presidential administration. But still, these are different institutions. Although in this case, their goals might well coincide. And in fact, it's not by chance that I scheduled my speech, my online speech, specifically for October 26th. And it's called After Putin. Well, in this case, it's an interesting coincidence.
Valery Ilyich, who is this Svetlana Dragan? Why does she have access to such secret information? Please tell us about her.
I don't know much about her except for what I mentioned in the episode you just showed to the viewers. Yes, she is connected to the Russian authorities. She acts like many well-known astrologers, in fact, according to certain guidelines from the Russian authorities. In Russia, predictions by Baba Vanga are also popular. It's the same kind of thing. It's just that October 27th is not actually a date that could be determined by the stars. Although I know there were also astrological forecasts predicting Putin's death in the period between October 22nd to 23rd and around November 7th. And his death supposedly fit right into that time frame. The thing is, there was already a forecast at the beginning in mid-October, actually at the start of October. Again, this came from that same consortium. The thing is, at this stage, it's possible to determine the date of death with very high accuracy with a margin of just a few days. And I can tell you that Putin outlived himself. He was supposed to die a few days earlier, somewhere on Sunday, Monday during the night from Sunday to Monday, but he actually passed away on the evening of Thursday, October 26th. So you can look to the stars, or you can simply rely on medicine, on modern medicine, which is highly qualified in this area, including when a person is terminally ill and has entered the final stretch. You can ask around, Dasha, and good doctors will tell you. They can name the date of death with accuracy down to the day.
Valery Dmitrievich, what is the Patrushev group preparing? Will there be a transfer of power, and what will it look like? You cover this topic in great detail on both channels. I know I've watched, but I'm interested in your outlook for the future.
Yes, agreements were reached. You could call it a large package of agreements at the turn of November and December regarding the transfer of power, regarding who will become prime minister after Vasilievich is elected president. The outcome seems predictable. As for who will join the cabinet of ministers and who will leave it, regarding how many governors need to be replaced and so on. So this is a package concerning major personnel changes, very significant ones. And then the plan is to repeat that scenario. At the end of 1999, when the then President Yeltsin announced his resignation, and according to the constitution, his duties were assumed by the then Prime Minister Putin, who subsequently was elected president. The plan is to repeat this scenario. However, these agreements, this scenario, will encounter very serious obstacles, extremely serious ones. It is quite possible, or even likely, that this scenario will be revised along the way, that some problems will arise. I will talk about this at the end of December. On December 26th, I will be holding my online meeting. I won't be summing up the year. It's customary to sum up the year, but I will actually be talking about the future, about big plans and what could stand in their way. I hope that by that time I will have quite a lot of exclusive and sensitive information to share. So as usual in Russia, things look smooth on paper, but when it comes to walking, well, not only in Russia, actually in Ukraine too, you have to walk along the edge. Planning and reality. They are very different from each other, and that's a good thing.
But the PAK is planning to stay. Maria Vorontsova, the position of this healthcare official. And I heard Gennady Vladimir Gudkov, by the way, he has great respect for you and we regularly do streams together. He said that according to his information, Sechin might become a deputy in the government. How credible is this information?
Gennady Vladimirovich is truly a person I have great personal sympathy for. He's a real human being, and we've always had a very good relationship, which I hope will continue. Yes, that's true. Sechin is being considered for the post of deputy prime minister, overseeing the fuel and energy sector. That's true. But let me repeat once again, Dasha, all of this is just speculation at this point. What will actually come to pass and how it will happen is completely unclear. The situation is marked by a very high level of turbulence. So far, this turbulence is confined to the elite. For now, it's within the elite. So it's not very noticeable yet. If you do not have any of your own people there, it may still manifest itself. It may come out into the open, as it did, for example, with Prigozhin's uprising on June 24th of this year. So most likely we are in for some very big surprises.
You mentioned that when Putin died, the first person to urgently fly to Dubai was Rothenberg, if I'm not mistaken.
Arkady Rothenberg, yes. On the morning of October 27th, he flew to Dubai. And as far as I know, he stayed there for quite a long time.
Now, Putin has just made a visit to Saudi Arabia with Kadyrov. On the day of the United Arab Emirates, Potanin was with them. He is called the richest man in Russia. Do you think a number of oligarchs might flee Russia now, considering the nationalization of assets you mentioned?
Yes, maybe they would run away, Dasha, but where to? Where could they go? You see, it's like from the dawn. Back in the day, there was no extradition, just like with the Zaporizhian Sich. But now it turns out there's nowhere to run from Russia, because you could end up under sanctions there. So where to? Well, Potanin could go to Israel. You could go to the Emirates. But the tills are in Russia. You see, if you leave, you might save your life, maybe. And even then, your life isn't guaranteed, because they can get to you anywhere. Don't underestimate the capabilities of the Russian special services. If they set their mind to it, they'll find you anywhere, wherever you are. But your assets remain in Russia. Well, if you leave, it just makes it easier to nationalize your assets. That's why if they want to keep their assets, it's better for them to stay in Russia, show loyalty to the new authorities, and fight to preserve what they have. Well, I can tell you this, Patrushev doesn't care about their loyalty. He deeply and consistently despises them. He believes they do not rightfully own these assets. He especially deeply and consistently despises those close to Putin's inner circle. Well, the oligarchs among them, that is. Potanin still, in a way, belongs to the Yeltsin-era oligarchs. Actually, not just in a way, but in the literal sense of the word. And then there is the Putin generation of oligarchs. And this is going to be very interesting. This is one of the reasons for a conflict that could arise. A very serious conflict. Because Nikolai Platonovich is a chef who, as they used to say about Stalin, knows how to cook up spicy dishes.
Valery Dmitrievich, what is the relationship between Patrushev and Putin? I remember Mark Zakharovich Fagin and Gennady Vladimirovich Gudkov told me that for Alina Kabaeva's 40th birthday, they supposedly celebrated it on a yacht. It was on the yacht of one of the oligarchs, close to Putin, and all the big businessmen were there, the Rothenbergs and others, but neither Patrushev nor Zolotov were there. He was not invited to Alina Kabaeva's 40th birthday. When asked why, Mark Zakhar said that the relationship between Patrushev and Putin is complicated. So, Valery Dmitrievich, how complicated is their relationship really and why? Was Patrushev not at Irina Kabaeva's birthday celebration?
Patrushev has a very negative attitude toward the upstart Alina Maratovna. Very negative. And it's not that he has a bad relationship with Putin. He had a very good business-like relationship with Putin. Among the people close to Putin, not his personal friends, but I would say his so-called business partners or like-minded associates, the closest and most influential has always been Nikolai Patrushev, the closest and most influential. Yes. In the last months of his life, he had grown weary of Putin. Note, not Putin of Patrushev, but Patrushev of Putin. A completely different type of relationship. And Patrushev gave the order to ignore all of Putin's commands, and they were ignored. During the leader's last month of life, all his orders were ignored. In other words, they would say, yes, yes, everything will be done. But in reality, they didn't care at all. That's why Alina Maratovna is currently under house arrest with her children. specifically in that Valdai residence where her husband's frozen body is kept in the refrigerator. It's not even irony, it's cruel sarcasm. She and Putin had a very good relationship. Sometimes they would deteriorate, but overall their relationship was such that it couldn't really go bad. You understand? Because you see, if people are bound by what Putin and Patrushev were bound by, then that bond is unbreakable, chained together as one, in the literal sense of the word, by a single chain, and by spilled blood, of course, which is stronger than any chain.
Valery Dmitrievich, you, in general, Stanislav Belkovsky often repeats that the gay lobby rules Russia. That's a quote. I've heard this very often. In your last interview, you said that Patrushev opposes this gay lobby that rules Russia. Can you elaborate on this in more detail?
The gay lobby does not rule Russia, although it is very influential. I think that if you compare it to the influence of the gay lobby in other countries, then in Russia it was, at least, it used to be the most influential. I won't explain the structure and the reasons. I just don't want to publicly name some of the people who ensured the influence of this lobby. Yes, Patrushev intends not just to reduce its influence, but to throw it out of power altogether. This is one of the reasons why a number of people who, generally speaking, are distinguished professionally for their effectiveness will be dismissed. A number of deputy prime ministers, several ministers, and about half of the officials in the presidential administration. And also, for example, the head of the State Duma as well. Yes, that's the list. It may not be the longest, but it is exhaustive. And these are truly influential people in every sense of the word. I'm not even talking about, well, cultural figures. In this case, it's not worth discussing them, you understand. They don't really influence political decision-making. But when it comes to Category A officials, yes, a thorough purge is being planned. And I think this will also be one of the lines of conflict.
So it turns out that Patrushev has a particularly negative attitude toward all these Western democratic values. He's more authoritarian because he doesn't accept LGBT representatives in power. Is that the right understanding?
He has a negative attitude toward almost everything. Toward the opposition, toward democracy, toward the United States, toward the United Kingdom. Well, just like any normal, in quotes or without quotes, a Soviet Chekist, a negative attitude toward the United Kingdom, and I would say an exaggerated perception of its capabilities. This is an old Soviet-style corporate culture that goes back specifically to Soviet times. And Nikolai Patrushev, yes, he and Putin are from the same generation. They seem to have absorbed the same values, but there is a significant difference between them, or rather there was. The thing is, Putin was not susceptible to certain phantasmagorical ideas. One of these ideas concerned Ukraine specifically. I would call them phantasmagorical, absolutely wild. Patrushev is a highly ideologized person. Patrushev sincerely mourned and still mourns the collapse of the Soviet Union. From his point of view, many Soviet practices can be revived under new conditions and with new tools. For example, to establish total control using digital technology, just like what the Chinese are doing. And that's something they're already trying to do, at least in part, in the Russian Federation, introducing a series of bans, doing this and that. Moreover, he believes it's entirely possible to supply consumer markets, to nationalize a number of major assets. In other words, to create a kind of Soviet Union 2.0. Putin, in fact, didn't really care much about this. He was interested in his own greatness. And I would say the restoration of a certain geopolitical center of power, turning Russia into a geopolitical center that surpasses, not in formal size, but in influence, the now defunct Soviet Union. He believed that this was entirely possible. I don't know whether it was possible or not, but the plans that were described to me were dizzying, truly. But in some aspects, they were quite realistic, if only they hadn't run into Ukraine. Putin bitterly regretted at the end of February last year that he started with Ukraine. He bitterly regretted it because initially he actually intended to start with other countries.
Is it the Baltic states or perhaps Kazakhstan?
Countries, well, like Belarus and Kazakhstan. The issue could have been resolved, you understand, extremely simply and quickly with the Baltics. And the initial plan, which the plan dated back to the spring of 2020. And it was derailed by the pandemic. And also by some other circumstances, it was supposed to be a large-scale hybrid operation, not a classic military operation. I want to draw your attention to this. It was nothing like what happened with Ukraine. A large-scale hybrid operation, very well thought out and extremely ingenious, specifically aimed at the Baltic states.
Valery Dmitrievich, yesterday Biden made a statement that Putin is preparing to attack the Baltic states and that in that case, Americans would fight against Russians. Is it possible that in the next 6 years, Putin will decide to attack the Baltic states?
Well, Putin can fight in hell as much as he wants, as his master commands. No, Russia doesn't have those kinds of resources. What Biden said is not just an exaggeration, it's an outright rhetorical lie. Well, I understand what motivates this lie, the need to get Congress to allocate funding for Ukraine. He's resorting to some very strong statements. No, this won't happen. It won't even be in the plans as far as I can see the situation.
Valery Dmitrievich, you said that Gerasimov drank heavily and that Gerasimov did not want to fight against Ukraine. How accurate is this information?
This information is accurate. Valery Gerasimov was one of the few people who in 2014 to 2015 persuaded the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. He was categorically against launching a massive operation against Ukraine, but by the end of 2021, Putin broke him. And you know, there's a somewhat risque joke. It's better to give in than to resist. It's just easier to give in. Well, Gerasimov acted in pretty much the same way. But the plan for the operation against Ukraine that he developed was fundamentally different from what Putin ordered to be done. According to Gerasimov's plan, the armed forces of the Russian Federation were not supposed to cross the border for a month. Instead, missile, bomb, and artillery strikes would be carried out on Ukrainian infrastructure, both military and sensitive civilian infrastructure. In other words, this is more or less similar to what NATO countries once did with regard to Yugoslavia. And then over the course of a month, observe the reaction. If it became necessary to carry out a combined arms operation, a ground operation. Well, he insisted that this probably wouldn't even be necessary. But Putin, on the other hand, wanted to win the glory of being the greatest military commander of all time and all peoples. So his Ukrainian friends talked him into it, right? Well, apparently, yes. They explained it to him, tried to convince him. Well, not only them, of course, he also relied in part on some intelligence assessments that were falsified from the start, that Ukraine would collapse. It would collapse. And that indeed, on the third day, the Russian armed forces would be in Kyiv. According to this plan, they were supposed to be in Odessa by the end of the second week or the beginning of the third. And by the end of the third week of the operation, they would enter the territory of Moldova. And there it would only take a day. After that, there was a strategic crossroads, where to move next. They would have had to move northwest, not west, toward the Baltic Sea, or they could have moved south and east. That is toward Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The plans were very, very ambitious. But once again, everything broke against Ukraine. And already by the end of February, that is literally just a few days later, it became clear that the plan, specifically Putin's plan, Putin's ideas turned out to be completely mistaken. And I can tell you that the situation in the Russian General Staff was very tense at that moment. Extremely tense, especially after the landing in Hostomel. Am I putting the stress correctly? In Hostomel. It was crushed, though part of the force managed to withdraw. It turned out that the Ukrainians were not retreating, not falling back. They were resisting very effectively, and that everything was going wrong. And in general, at that moment in March, this is true. At the end of March, Ukraine could have signed a peace agreement that suited it. I emphasize, one that suited Ukraine more than the Russian Federation. In
March
of last year.
When you say that, what do you mean?
So according to the draft that was in circulation and that the Kremlin was ready to accept, all the new territories would be abandoned. Donbas would be declared an autonomy within Ukraine. I emphasize, it would not become part of Russia, meaning its status would change. And moreover, Russia agreed to sign an agreement in which Ukraine would recognize the status of Crimea as disputed. In other words, Russia would have effectively called its own sovereignty over Crimea into question. Let me draw your attention to this, Dasha. These were proposals coming from the Russian side. But in return, military actions would have stopped.
And there was probably some kind of provision that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO, the European, yes.
That Ukraine commits not to join NATO, and the issue of the European Union was not as pressing. So that's what it commits to. And in Russia, this would have been declared a tremendous victory, meaning the main objectives of the operation had been achieved and it could be ended. And all of this was at stake in March, at the end of March last year. I won't presume to judge what was working against it here. I'm not sure. And in fact, I'm really not sure that It's not necessary to blame Johnson for this. From my point of view, that's just trying to shift the blame from the guilty to the innocent. The decision was made by the Ukrainian leadership, without a doubt.
Valery Dmitrievich, is it true that Abramovich and Umarov, who was then a member of the negotiation group, were poisoned?
I don't know. I have no knowledge of that. I wouldn't rule out that they could have been, not with the aim of killing them, but just to scare them a little. That's a kind of a method of pressure. Well, you start feeling unwell and it could happen again, and next time it might be fatal.
Valery Dmitrievich, thank you for finding the time.
Thank you very much.
You very rarely give interviews to the Priamy TV channel, I know that. I hope we will meet with you more often because the audience is really very interested in your opinions. Friends, today my guest was Valery Dmitrievich Solovey, a well-known political scientist. Valery Dmitrievich, thank you and see you soon.
Thank you very much, Dasha. Thank you very much to you, our esteemed viewers and listeners. Goodbye.